The Warborn Empire, once a shining beacon of conquest and terror, had fallen into chaos. In its prime, it controlled vast swaths of the galaxy, with fleets of warships that blotted out the stars and warriors genetically engineered to be unstoppable. But now, as the remnants of its fleet drifted through the void, its once unyielding grip on the galaxy had crumbled, fragmented by rebellion and betrayal. The Emperor, once a titan of power, was dead, killed by a trusted general, in a move that shook the Empire to its core. Only one heir remained, Prince Callan. The assassination attempt on his life had come swiftly, without warning. One moment, Callan had been standing beside his father's deathbed, gazing at the ancient throne that had ruled the Warborn Empire for centuries. The next moment, gunfire echoed through the royal hall, and everything fell into chaos. His father's advisors turned on him, eager to claim the throne for themselves. Callan's bodyguards, fiercely loyal to the Warborn bloodline, fought valiantly to protect him, but the betrayal was too swift, too devastating. He barely managed to escape, slipping away through secret corridors that had once been used for emergency evacuations. Outside the palace, the streets were aflame. Explosions rocked the skyline as rival factions clashed over control of the empire. The streets, once teeming with life and power, were now flooded with chaos, with rebels, former allies, and opportunistic criminals all vying for dominance. Callan's pulse hammered in his chest as he ran, adrenaline coursing through his veins. The once mighty Warborn fleet had been scattered to the far reaches of the galaxy, its soldiers now mere shadows of their former selves, betrayed and hunted by their own people. It was only when Callan reached the hidden hangar beneath the royal palace that he realized the extent of his father's foresight. There, parked in a dimly lit bay, was a single transport ship, a relic from the days of the Empire's earliest conquests. Its hull was battered, its systems outdated, but it was functional. Callan didn't hesitate. He boarded the ship, his only thoughts on escaping and surviving. As the ship powered up and blasted into the atmosphere, the royal palace was consumed in a massive explosion, signaling the fall of the last Warborn stronghold. Callan stared out at the vastness of space, the only home he had ever known slipping away into the void. Alone. In that moment, he could almost feel his father's presence beside him. The Emperor had always said the throne was not a mere seat of power. It was a weapon, a tool that could reshape the galaxy. Callan had never truly understood what that meant, not until now. He had been raised as a prince, destined to rule, but now he had nothing. No army, no allies, and no kingdom to inherit. The ship's engines hummed, and Callan slumped in his seat, staring at the flashing stars outside. He couldn't help but feel the weight of his lineage pressing down on him. The Warborn Empire had been built on conquest, bloodshed, and control, but had it all been for nothing? Was there anything left of his father's vision? Was the Empire beyond saving? The ship lurched as it broke through the outer layers of the planet's atmosphere, and Callan's mind raced. He couldn't remain on the run forever. He needed to find a way to survive, to rebuild. The galaxy was in chaos, and while his bloodline may have been the cause of much of that destruction, it also held the key to its salvation. His father had left him with a final piece of advice before he died. The throne is not just a seat of power, it is a weapon. Do not let the galaxy forget what it once was. As the stars stretched out before him, Callan knew the only way forward was to embrace his birthright, not just as a leader of men, but as a symbol of the Warborn's might and legacy. But to do that, he would need to rebuild the Warborn Empire from the ashes, using the power of his bloodline, his father's knowledge, and a fleet of loyal soldiers who had not yet given up hope. The journey ahead would not be easy, but Callan was the last of his kind, the last lord of the Warborn throne, and he would stop at nothing to reclaim it. Callan's ship drifted silently through the blackness of space, the stars stretching endlessly before him. He had no destination, no plan, but he knew he couldn't stay hidden forever. The galaxy was too vast, and word of the Warborn's fall would spread quickly. In his wake, chaos would follow. It was inevitable. He needed allies. He needed information. But above all, he needed to understand the power his father had spoken of, the weapon that was the throne. The ship's navigation system buzzed softly, pulling Kalen from his thoughts. A small, uncharted system appeared on his scanner, one that hadn't registered on any galactic map for centuries. Intrigued, Kalen adjusted his course, hoping to find something useful, anything to give him an edge. After hours of quiet flight, his ship entered the system, its silence broken only by the hum of the engines. The gravitational pull of a nearby planet tugged at the ship, bringing it closer to the surface. The planet was small, its surface mostly barren, but Kalen could feel something beneath the lifeless world. There was a pulse, an energy, almost as if the planet itself was alive. He set the ship down in a dusty, forgotten valley, the ship's landing gear screeching against the cracked earth. When the door opened, a dry wind swept in, carrying with it the smell of old metal and ancient dust. The place felt wrong, but Kalen couldn't ignore the strange sense of familiarity it held. He stood at the entrance to the ship for a long moment, gazing out over the horizon, as if waiting for something to happen. Finally, he stepped forward. The wind died as suddenly as it had started, leaving only an eerie stillness in the air. It didn't take long for Kalen to realize that this was no ordinary world. The landscape was littered with the ruins of long-forgotten structures, remnants of a civilization that had vanished. He could see, even from a distance, the distinct markings of Warborn architecture, monolithic stone columns and crumbling temples covered in centuries of grime. This was a place tied to his people, a lost relic of the Empire. As Kalen made his way deeper into the ruins, a faint hum reached his ears, growing louder with every step. It was an ancient sound, something he had heard only in the oldest, most classified records of Warborn history. The hum led him to a massive stone doorway, half hidden by overgrown vines and moss. Without hesitation, Kalen pushed open the heavy stone door. Inside, the temperature dropped immediately, and Kalen's breath fogged in the air. The chamber beyond was vast, its walls lined with strange carvings depicting the Warborn in their most glorious days. Warriors, kings, and generals, standing proud as they conquered star systems. At the center of the chamber stood a pedestal, atop which rested a glowing orb, pulsating with a faint blue light. Kalen approached it cautiously, drawn to it like a moth to a flame. The moment his fingers brushed against the surface of the orb, the chamber seemed to come alive. Ancient mechanisms stirred to life, and the ground beneath his feet trembled. A low, mechanical voice filled the air, speaking in the ancient Warborn tongue, a language Kalen had never truly understood. But even though he couldn't comprehend the words, the meaning behind them was unmistakable. The hair has returned. Suddenly, the walls of the chamber shifted, revealing hidden passageways leading deeper into the heart of the ruin. A shadowed figure appeared in the doorway of one passage, a tall, armored figure with the unmistakable insignia of the Warborn Empire emblazoned on its chest. The figure's helmet glinted in the low light, and Kalen instinctively reached for the weapon at his side. "Do not be afraid, my lord," the figure said, its voice calm but filled with an odd mechanical resonance. "I am the last of the Guardians. I have waited for you." Kalen's heart skipped a beat. "The Guardians?" he asked, still wary. "Who are you?" The figure stepped forward, lowering its helmet. Beneath it was the face of a woman, aged but still strong, her eyes sharp and clear. She wore the marks of someone who had seen countless battles. Her presence was undeniable, almost otherworldly. "I was once one of the Warborn's most trusted generals," she said, her voice filled with an eerie sadness. "I was part of the final legion stationed here, guarding the weapon, your weapon. The throne, as your father called it. But we failed. And now, I am all that remains." Kalen's mind raced as he processed her words. This woman, this guardian, had been waiting for him, for the heir to the Warborn throne, all this time. The weapon his father had spoken of, the throne, was not just a chair of power. It was something more, something far darker. "Tell me everything," Kalen demanded. "What is the throne? And where is it?" The Guardian's eyes met his, filled with a mixture of hope and dread. "The throne was never meant to be a symbol of power. It is a weapon, forged from the very DNA of the Warborn. It holds the key to rewriting the galaxy's future. But you must choose whether to wield it or destroy it. Your ancestors built it to conquer, to rule. But in the wrong hands, it will destroy everything." As the words sank in, Kalen felt the weight of his bloodline, the burden of his choices. The throne was not just his inheritance. It was a weapon that could either save or doom the galaxy. And now, it was up to him to decide. Kalen stood before the Guardian, his mind whirling with the weight of the revelations. The throne, a weapon capable of shaping the galaxy's destiny, was not just a relic of power. It was an instrument of unimaginable destruction or salvation. And now, Kalen was its rightful heir. The Guardian's words echoed in his mind as they lingered in the depths of the ruined chamber. His bloodline was not simply a symbol of royal privilege. It was a key to controlling the future. But the choice was his to make, whether to wield this power or destroy it. "Your ancestors made a grave mistake," the Guardian said, her voice rough with decades of grief. "They built an empire based on domination, on conquering worlds without mercy. They lost sight of the true meaning of strength. And now, that same strength is threatening to consume everything." Kalen nodded slowly, absorbing her words. His father had always spoken of the power of the throne, of the Warborn's divine right to rule. But never had he mentioned the consequences. Never had he hinted that the throne could be a weapon of mass destruction, capable of rewriting the very fabric of the galaxy itself. "You must choose, my lord," the Guardian continued. "The throne has been dormant for centuries, but it has begun to stir again. And with its power, you will either bring about a new era or plunge us into oblivion." Kalen's heart raced. He had already lost everything: his empire, his family, his home. The galaxy was in disarray, torn apart by factions and infighting. But could he, a prince raised to rule with an iron fist, become the savior of the galaxy? Or was he destined to repeat the mistakes of those who came before him? His thoughts were interrupted by a sudden noise, footsteps coming from the shadows. Instinctively, Kalen reached for the weapon at his side, his fingers brushing the hilt of the ancient sword his father had gifted him. The Guardian tensed as well, her hand resting on the hilt of her own blade. A figure emerged from the darkness, stepping into the flickering light. It was a woman, dressed in the tattered remains of a Warborn uniform, her face obscured by a faded helmet. She moved with a fluid grace, like a shadow slipping through the ruins. "You shouldn't be here," the Guardian said, her voice hard. "This place is forbidden." The woman's helmet lifted, revealing a face that was both familiar and alien. Kalen's breath caught in his throat as he recognized her. It was Cirrus, the leader of the rebellion. Kalen's pulse quickened. Cirrus was one of the most dangerous figures in the galaxy. A former Warborn general turned rebel leader, she had been responsible for countless acts of sabotage against the Empire. Her hatred for the Warborn ran deep, and she would stop at nothing to see its influence erased. "I know who you are, Cirrus," Kalen said, his voice steady despite the shock of the encounter. "But I don't know why you're here. This place, this weapon, is not for you." Cirrus laughed, the sound hollow and bitter. "Is that what you think, Prince Kalen?" she asked, her eyes narrowing. "You think the throne, this weapon, is meant for one person alone. You are wrong. The throne was never meant to be a tool of oppression. It was meant to be a tool of liberation, if used properly." Kalen shook his head, trying to make sense of her words. "Liberation. The Warborn Empire has only ever brought death and destruction. The throne, my father's throne, is a symbol of everything that is wrong with this galaxy." Cirrus stepped closer, her gaze unwavering. "And yet you are the last of your kind, the last lord of the Warborn throne. You are a relic of a bygone era, Kalen, but that doesn't mean you have to follow in your father's footsteps. You have the power to change everything. Kalen stared at her, his mind racing. The rebellion, born from the ashes of the Warborn Empire, had one goal: to eradicate everything his people had built. They wanted to erase the Warborn legacy from the galaxy's history, and in doing so, they sought to destroy any hope of a future tied to the throne. But Ceres wasn't just a rebel leader. She was a visionary, someone who saw beyond the bloodshed of the past and yearned for something better. You want me to use the throne to destroy the Warborn's legacy, Kalen said quietly, to undo everything that came before. But you don't understand. The throne isn't just a weapon. It's more than that. It's a choice. Ceres studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. And what will your choice be, Prince Kalen? Will you cling to the past and use that throne to rebuild the empire, or will you destroy it and end the cycle of violence that has plagued us all? Before Kalen could answer, a low rumble shook the ground beneath their feet, and the lights in the chamber flickered. A series of alarms blared, signaling a breach in the outer perimeter of the ruin. The sound of battle reached their ears. Blaster fire, the clash of metal on metal. The rebellion had found them. Kalen gripped his sword tightly, feeling the weight of the decision pressing on him more than ever. He was not yet ready to make his choice, but he could no longer run from his destiny. The throne was his birthright, and with it came a power that could change the galaxy forever. But would he be the one to wield it? The chamber trembled with the sound of approaching forces, the walls vibrating under the impact of distant explosions. The ground beneath Kalen's feet shook as the alarms blared louder, and the flickering lights cast long shadows across the stone walls. Ceres didn't flinch at the noise. Instead, her gaze remained fixed on him, calculating, patient. Kalen gripped the hilt of his sword tighter, his knuckles white. He knew the rebellion would stop at nothing to destroy what remained of the Warborn. But Ceres, standing before him, offered a twisted alternative. A chance to use the throne, the weapon, to undo everything his father had built. "I don't trust you," Kalen said, his voice low but firm, trying to steady his racing thoughts. "Your rebellion would tear this galaxy apart if given the chance. You can't erase the past by destroying the throne. It's not just a symbol of the Warborn. It's part of us. My people's legacy is in it." Ceres' eyes hardened, and she took a step closer, her expression conflicted but resolute. "And what do you think your father left behind? A legacy of cruelty, a legacy built on bloodshed. You carry the weight of that legacy on your shoulders, Kalen, but you don't have to carry it forever. You don't have to destroy everything that came before, but you can use the throne to forge something new." The distant sounds of blaster fire grew louder, signaling the rebellion's advance. Kalen knew the forces outside weren't just rebels. There were others too. The Warborn Empire, though in ruins, had its enemies. Many factions, both internal and external, sought to claim the throne for themselves. His father's enemies would have tracked him here, sensing an opportunity to reclaim the power that had once been theirs. A sudden explosion rocked the chamber, sending dust and debris flying through the air. The stone walls cracked, and a deep rumbling shook the very foundation of the ruin. A voice echoed through the debris-filled silence, distorted by static and the crackling of communication systems. "Lord Kalen, do you copy? We've detected multiple enemy ships approaching the system. Your position is compromised. We need to evacuate immediately." Kalen's heart skipped. The voice belonged to one of the last loyal officers in his father's fleet, a fleet that had been scattered in the wake of the Warborn's fall. The officer had tracked Kalen to this remote system, the last hope of the Warborn's restoration. The officer's voice was grim, but it carried with it a sense of urgency. Time was running out. Kalen looked back at Ceres, his mind racing. If he left now, he could escape the immediate danger. But the legacy of his father, the Empire, and the throne would still be there, waiting for him. Ceres was right about one thing. The galaxy would never be the same. The throne held the key to rebuilding, or ending, the Warborn legacy, but Callan had no intention of letting it fall into the wrong hands. "I'll come with you," Callan said to Cirrus, surprising himself. "But we don't have time for more speeches. If we're going to survive, we need to move now. We'll settle this later." Cirrus studied him for a moment, her eyes cold, calculating. Then, without a word, she turned and led the way deeper into the ruin. Callan followed, his sword drawn and ready. Every step felt heavier, his thoughts clouded by the burden of his birthright, the decision that loomed over him. What was the right choice? Was he destined to rebuild the Warborn, to reclaim what had been lost? Or was the galaxy better off without him on the throne at all? The further they moved, the more Callan felt the weight of the centuries pressing down on him. The walls seemed to close in, the air thick with the memories of those who had once ruled from this very place. He could feel his father's presence here, as if the ancient emperor was watching him, waiting for his choice. As they reached a lower level of the ruin, they came to a small, hidden docking bay. It was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of emergency panels on the walls. A ship waited there, small but sleek, its hull marked with the insignia of the rebellion. Callan's hand hovered over his weapon. He was not certain of Cirrus's true intentions. The rebellion had claimed to fight for freedom, but they had never hesitated to use violence to achieve their goals. What if this was a trap? What if Cirrus's talk of liberation was just a cover for her own ambitions? Before he could voice his doubts, Cirrus turned to him. "The ship is ready. We don't have much time. We'll need to get to my base of operations before the fleet arrives. Once we're there, we can regroup and plan our next move. But understand this, Callan, you're not just running away. You're making a choice that will determine the future of this galaxy." Callan met her gaze, searching for any trace of deceit, but all he saw was a fierce resolve. Whether he liked it or not, Cirrus was right. This moment was pivotal. He could no longer delay making a decision about the throne. It wasn't just a weapon. It was the nexus of the galaxy's future. He nodded once, taking a step toward the ship. "Let's go." The moment he stepped onto the ship, the door slid shut behind him, and they blasted off into the void. Callan couldn't shake the feeling that, in leaving this place, he was leaving something behind. Something crucial. But there was no turning back now. As the ship ascended into the darkened sky, Callan glanced at Cirrus, and for the first time, he saw the weight of the future in her eyes. She wasn't just fighting to destroy the Warborn. She was fighting to create something new. But would Callan stand with her in that fight, or would he ultimately choose the throne and the empire that came with it? The answer, Callan knew, was not yet clear, and time was running out. The ship's engines hummed steadily as they rocketed away from the ruined planet. Callan stood at the window, staring into the dark expanse of space. The swirling void outside seemed endless, a constant reminder that the galaxy was far too vast for him to navigate alone. He couldn't shake the weight of what had just transpired. The throne, his legacy, the war. It all seemed so distant now, like ghosts haunting him in the dark. And yet, he couldn't escape their grasp. The interior of the ship was quiet, save for the soft hum of machinery and the occasional crackle of static over the comms. Cirrus had retreated to the cockpit, leaving Callan alone to his thoughts. He needed to think, to understand what he was becoming. A rebel leader, a king, or something else entirely. His father's words about the throne rang in his ears, but they seemed less and less relevant now. The empire his father had built was dead, and Callan wasn't sure whether he could, or even wanted to, revive it. His gaze shifted to the data pad on the table beside him. It was a relic from his father's time, one of the few pieces of Warborn technology that had survived the Empire's collapse. He had not dared look at it since he had fled the palace. But now, with nothing but time on his hands, he opened it. The device flickered to life, revealing a series of encrypted files. One in particular caught his eye, a message from his father. Callan hesitated before activating it. The voice that filled the room was unmistakable, the deep, commanding tone of Emperor Veros, Kaelin's late father. The message, recorded years before the Warborn's fall, spoke of the throne. But this time, there was no pride in his father's voice, no triumphant declarations of conquest. Instead, the Emperor sounded weary, almost afraid. "My son," Vero's voice began, "I have made many decisions in my life, and most of them were wrong. The throne, the power it holds, is not meant for one man. It never was. The empire I built was never meant to last. I have seen the future, Kaelin. I have seen what happens when one holds too much power. We will be consumed by it." The message cut off abruptly, leaving Kaelin in stunned silence. His father had known. He had known that the throne, this symbol of power and oppression, would eventually destroy them all. And yet he had left it to Kaelin, the last of the Warborn, the last hope for a galaxy that had long since forgotten what it had lost. Kaelin's fingers trembled as he placed the data pad down, his mind racing. His father had spoken the truth. The throne, the weapon, was not just a tool for ruling. It was a curse. But if it was a curse, could Kaelin break it? Could he destroy the very thing that had ruined his family and the galaxy? The door to the cockpit opened, and Saris entered, her face unreadable. Kaelin turned to face her, the question on his mind still unanswered. But her expression told him that time was running out. The rebellion was getting closer. The galaxy was closing in on him, and the choice he faced could no longer be delayed. "We're almost at the rebellion's base," Saris said, her voice low, almost hesitant. "I know this isn't easy for you, but we don't have much time. The factions you're trying to escape, your father's enemies, they know you're alive. They know you have the throne, and they'll stop at nothing to take it from you." Kaelin met her gaze, his mind still torn. "What if I don't want it? What if I don't want the throne at all?" Saris didn't blink. "You may not want it, Kaelin, but it's yours, and they will come for it. It's not just a symbol of power, it's the last remaining piece of the Warborn. And as long as it exists, the galaxy will be in turmoil. You can destroy it, or you can use it to reshape everything." Kaelin stared out the window again, his thoughts scattered, his future uncertain. He had fled his birthright, hoping to escape the expectations, the weight of the Warborn legacy. But now, it felt like there was no escape. The throne was a part of him, a part of his bloodline. Whether he wanted it or not, it was his to wield. The soft hum of the ship's engines cut through the silence, a constant reminder of the ticking clock. They were almost at their destination, the rebellion's hidden base. Kaelin couldn't help but feel a growing sense of dread as they approached. The rebellion wasn't a sanctuary. It was a war machine, a faction as ruthless as any the Warborn had ever known. And he was walking into it, willingly, knowing that every decision he made from here on out would determine the future. Saris moved to the comms console, her fingers flying over the controls. "We're entering the system," she said. "Prepare yourself. Once we're inside the base, there's no turning back. We'll be expected to make our stand. The rebellion will want your support, and your throne." Kaelin nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. "I'm ready." He wasn't sure if he was lying to her, to himself, or to the galaxy, but it didn't matter. They were heading into the heart of the storm, and the throne, with all its weight and power, was the only thing that could keep them alive. The ship shuddered slightly as they broke through the atmosphere of a distant moon. Kaelin could feel the tension in the air, thick with uncertainty. Whatever lay ahead, it would change everything. But would it be the end or a new beginning? As they descended toward the base, Kaelin knew that he couldn't keep running forever. The throne would either be his weapon or his curse. The base was carved into the side of a moon's jagged mountain range, hidden from the prying eyes of the galaxy's major factions. As the ship descended, Kaelin gazed out the window, watching the shadowed landscape grow larger. The atmosphere was thick with tension, the horizon marked by the looming presence of rebellion ships, silent and waiting. The ship touched down with a slight jolt, and the landing ramp hissed open. Saris stood, her figure framed by the dim light of the hangar bay. The muted sounds of activity filled the air. Soldiers moving about, preparing for the next phase of their war. This was no sanctuary. This was a battlefield, and Callan was now at the heart of it. Saris led him down the narrow corridors, her footsteps quick and decisive. She didn't say a word as they walked, but Callan could feel the weight of her gaze, her focus unwavering. She wasn't just bringing him to the rebellion. She was staking everything on him, on the Warborn heir. They reached a steel door, reinforced and locked with multiple security systems. Saris tapped a sequence on the panel, and the door slid open with a sharp hiss. Beyond it lay a large room, lit by dim overhead lights, its walls covered with tactical maps and displays. The room fell silent as they entered. A half-dozen figures stood around a central table, their eyes shifting to Callan. They were the leaders of the rebellion, faces hardened by years of struggle, their eyes wary of the man who had once been a prince, a symbol of the Warborn Empire. Now, he was an enigma, a potential savior or a threat. At the head of the table stood a tall man with a grizzled face, his gray hair pulled back in a tight ponytail. His eyes were sharp, measuring. His name was Commander Valen, the leader of the rebellion. "Lord Callan," he said, his voice rough, as if it had been years since he had spoken kindly to anyone. "We've been waiting for you. Welcome." Callan nodded curtly, his gaze sweeping the room. He could feel the weight of their expectations pressing on him, their hopes that he could somehow change the tide of their war. But Callan knew better than to think he had the answers. The rebellion wasn't looking for a leader. They were looking for a symbol. And he was just the Warborn heir they needed. Saris moved to stand beside Valen, her eyes not leaving Callan. "We have intelligence that the Warborn loyalists are gathering strength," she said. "They won't stop until they've taken control of the throne. And with it, they'll try to restore the Empire." Valen's face darkened. "The throne has always been the heart of the Warborn," he said, his voice grim. "It's the beacon that calls them back, no matter how far they've fallen. But if Callan is to join us, we'll need to confront this threat head-on." Callan's hand tightened around the strap of his weapon, his mind racing. The rebellion wanted him to be a rallying point, a figurehead who could unite them against the remnants of the Warborn Empire. But he wasn't sure he was that person. The throne was still a looming presence in his life, a dark reminder of everything he'd lost and everything he stood to lose. "You're asking me to use the throne against my own people," Callan said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if I can do that." Saris stepped forward, her eyes intense. "This isn't about your people, Callan. It's about the galaxy. The throne is not just a tool of oppression. It's a weapon that must be destroyed. The Warborn, in all their power, never understood the true cost of what they built. You understand it now. And with that understanding comes the responsibility to stop it from happening again." Callan's heart raced. He could hear the weight in her words, feel the conviction behind them. But was it enough to convince him? The throne was his inheritance, his birthright. It had been passed down for generations, each ruler more corrupt than the last. But was it really the throne itself that was the problem, or the men who had wielded it? Commander Valen interrupted his thoughts, his tone blunt. "The Warborn have made their move. They're no longer just fighting for survival. They're fighting to restore the Empire. And they'll use any means necessary if you want to stop them. Callan, you need to choose. Will you stand with us, or will you let the throne fall into the hands of those who would destroy everything?" Callan felt the weight of his bloodline settle on his shoulders once more. His father's empire, once a beacon of power, had crumbled under the weight of its own ambition. The throne wasn't a symbol of greatness. It was a burden, a constant reminder of the cost of unchecked power. And yet he was still bound to it. There was no escaping it, no ignoring it. Saris's voice cut through the silence, soft but insistent. "You don't have to carry the throne alone. You can choose to break the cycle. The galaxy needs a new path. We can take that first step together. Kalen stood still, the decision hanging in the air like a blade waiting to fall. The past was a storm, and the future was a haze. He couldn't see the way forward, couldn't feel the certainty that had once guided him. All he had now was the choice: to embrace the throne and its legacy, or to turn away from it and trust in the uncertain future that lay before him. The room waited, its occupants silent, watching him closely. Kalen's hand hovered over his weapon, the weight of his decision pressing in on him. Finally, he spoke. "I'm not here to rebuild the Warborn Empire," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos inside him. "But I will not let it fall into the hands of those who would use it for their own ambitions. The throne will not be our weapon. I'll make sure of it." Saris's eyes softened, just slightly, and Commander Valen nodded, a grim respect in his gaze. "Then we move forward," Valen said, a hint of approval in his voice. "Together." And with that, Kalen's path was set. The throne would no longer rule him. He would face whatever came next, not as the last lord of the Warborn, but as something new, something better. The base hummed with activity as Kalen stepped into the operations room, the sounds of hurried footsteps and the murmur of conversations filling the air. The gravity of his decision settled in, its weight heavier than ever. He had taken a stand, rejecting the throne and the empire his father had built. But the path ahead was no less uncertain. Every choice now led him deeper into the heart of a war that would shape the galaxy's future. The rebellion's forces were gathering. Hundreds of soldiers, technicians, and spies were mobilizing, their resolve steeled by the promise of change. But Kalen couldn't help but feel the undercurrent of tension beneath their unity. Many of them had lost everything to the Warborn Empire. For some, Kalen was a symbol of that lost past, a past they wanted to bury. For others, he was a weapon to wield, a tool to secure victory. And Kalen was uncertain where he fit into all of it. Saris appeared at his side, her expression unreadable. She had said it was his choice, but Kalen knew that the rebellion was relying on him. Not as a leader, at least, not in the traditional sense, but as a rallying point. As the last of the Warborn bloodline, his very existence could shift the balance of power. If he sided with them, the rebellion would have more than just support. They would have legitimacy. But the cost of that legitimacy would be immense, and Kalen wasn't sure he was prepared to bear it. "We're ready to move out," Saris said, her voice quiet but firm. "The Warborn loyalists have begun to mobilize. Their fleet is scattered, but if they join forces under a single banner, they could become a serious threat." Kalen nodded, his mind racing. The Warborn Empire, despite its collapse, still had loyalists, generals, commanders, and even entire planets that had sworn allegiance to the throne. The remnants of his father's regime had never fully surrendered. They were a fragmented force now, but the rebellion's success relied on their destruction. And if Kalen could not unite the fractured Warborn remnants against their enemies, the galaxy would be plunged into endless war. "Do you have any idea where they are assembling?" Kalen asked, turning to Saris. "Intelligence is still coming in, but it looks like they're gathering near the outer rim, on a remote moon." Saris replied, "It's an old Warborn stronghold, one we've known about for years, but it's been abandoned for decades. Until now." Kalen's mind flashed to his father's time. The outer rim was where the Warborn had first begun to expand, conquering barren worlds and turning them into fortresses. The moon Saris mentioned was no more than a shadow now, an ancient relic of a past he was trying to leave behind. But it would be where the final conflict began, where his choice would be tested like never before. "We'll need to move quickly," Kalen said, his voice gaining strength. "If they're gathering there, it's only a matter of time before they launch a full-scale offensive. And if I'm going to make sure the throne doesn't fall into their hands, we need to act now." Saris met his gaze, her eyes calculating, but there was something in them, something soft, almost imperceptible. She was no longer just guiding him toward a cause. She was relying on him. The rebellion wasn't her fight alone anymore. It had become their fight. "You don't need to do this alone," she said, her voice quieter now. "The rebellion's with you. We're not just asking you to fight for us. We're asking you to fight for the future." The weight of her words hung in the air between them, and Kalen felt the pull of responsibility once again. The galaxy was fractured, divided between those who wanted to rebuild the Warborn Empire and those who wanted to destroy it entirely. But in the end, it was not the throne that would decide the galaxy's fate. It was the choices of those who sought it. Kalen turned to the operations table, where the holographic map flickered with data. He ran his fingers over the interface, pinpointing the moon in question. It was a vast, desolate place, but its location made it an ideal staging ground for an army. The Warborn loyalists would be expecting an attack. He had to act before they could organize fully. "Let's get ready," Kalen said, his voice firm now. "We'll strike at the heart of their operation. If we hit them hard enough, we can stop them from uniting." Valen entered the room, his eyes steely with determination. "We're all in this together now, Kalen. There's no turning back." Kalen met his gaze. "I understand that, but we need to be smart. This isn't just a military campaign. It's a chance to break the cycle. If we do this right, we can destroy the remnants of the Warborn once and for all. We're not just fighting to win. We're fighting to make sure no one ever has to fight for a throne again." Valen's eyes narrowed in thought. "You're asking us to burn everything to the ground. You know that, right? There's no rebuilding after that." Kalen nodded, his jaw clenched. "I know. But sometimes, the only way to move forward is to destroy what came before. The throne isn't just a symbol of power. It's a symbol of everything that went wrong. We need to make sure it stays buried." Cirrus stepped up beside Kalen, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. "And we will. Together." Kalen turned back to the map, his gaze resolute. The time for hesitation was over. He had made his choice. Now he would make sure the galaxy saw it through. As the rebellion's forces began to mobilize, Kalen could feel the storm gathering. The battle for the throne had become a battle for the future itself, and the price of victory would be higher than anything he had ever imagined. The rebellion's fleet assembled in the cold silence of space, its ships gliding through the void like a string of pearls. Kalen stood at the command deck of the flagship, his gaze fixed on the distant moon. The battle ahead would decide everything: the fate of the throne, the remnants of the Warborn Empire, and the galaxy's future. And yet, in the quiet before the storm, Kalen found himself questioning if anything truly mattered anymore. The choice had been made. The throne would not rise again, not under his rule. But could they really burn everything to the ground, as he had promised? Could the galaxy move forward, freed from the legacy of the Warborn? The buzz of activity around him felt distant, muffled as if it was happening in another life. The tension was palpable, not just among the rebellion's soldiers, but within Kalen himself. He could hear the soft hum of the ship's engines, the creaking of its metal hull, but the stillness within him was deafening. Cirrus entered the bridge, her face set in a determined mask. She was no longer the woman who had first found him, lost and broken, drifting in the void. She was a leader now, just as much as Kalen was, and she had staked everything on his decision, on his ability to carry through what they had set in motion. "You ready?" Cirrus asked, her voice steady, but laced with the weight of what was about to unfold. Kalen nodded, his eyes not leaving the moon that hovered on the screen. The Warborn loyalists had gathered there, preparing for their final stand. They believed they were about to restore the Empire, but they couldn't see that the war for the throne had already been lost. Not by them, but by the very concept of what the throne represented. "I'm ready," Kalen said, his voice quiet but resolute. "Let's finish this." Cirrus placed a hand on his shoulder, her grip firm and reassuring. "Whatever happens, Kalen, we're with you. You're not doing this alone." The words echoed in his mind as the fleet prepared for the final assault. His father's empire was crumbling before his eyes. The galaxy was on the verge of rebirth, or total destruction. Kalen's decision would either pave the way for a new era or ensure the galaxy's endless cycle of violence. The ship lurched as it entered the outer rim of the Warborn stronghold system. The enemy fleet, a scattered but determined force, loomed ahead. Their ships were ancient but still formidable, built with the same cold efficiency that had once made the Warborn a conquering force. But Kalen wasn't worried about their power. He was worried about their desperation. And desperation, he knew, led to chaos. "Ready the fleet," Kalen ordered, his voice steady now. "We move in 10 minutes." The bridge erupted into motion as officers scrambled to confirm the order. Saris stepped away to coordinate with the other ships in the fleet, but Kalen remained at the center of it all, watching the holographic projections of the battlefield unfold before him. Every part of him screamed that he wasn't ready for this, that he wasn't meant to be here. But he had no choice now. This was his fight, his war. The countdown began. 10 minutes. 5 minutes. Each passing second felt like an eternity, each breath heavier than the last. The weight of his bloodline, his father's legacy, was pressing on him harder than ever. He wasn't just fighting the remnants of the Warborn. He was fighting the past, the ghosts of a galaxy that had been shaped by fear, by bloodshed, by a hunger for power that had never been satisfied. The final moments ticked down, and Kalen's thoughts raced. What if he couldn't do it? What if the Warborn loyalists won? What if the galaxy would never truly be free of the past? 1 minute. The final countdown was upon them. The fleet's weapons systems powered up, and Kalen felt the hum of energy in the air. His fingers trembled slightly, but he forced himself to steady his hand, to steady his resolve. He was no longer the prince of an empire. He was the last son of a broken dynasty, and this was his chance to finish what had been started, to make sure the galaxy would never be ruled by a throne again. "Launch," Kalen ordered, his voice filled with certainty. The fleet moved in unison, its ships cutting through the darkness like a storm of vengeance. Lasers and missiles lit up the sky as they engaged the Warborn loyalists' forces. The battle was chaotic, fierce, and relentless, a clash of old and new. But Kalen could see the difference now. The Warborn were fighting for a ghost, a dream of an empire that no longer had a place in the galaxy. The rebellion, on the other hand, was fighting for the future. Saris fought at his side, her tactics flawless as they coordinated the fleet's movements. Valen's voice came over the comms, steady and authoritative, giving orders with precision. The Warborn fleet was formidable, but it was scattered, disorganized. The rebellion's unity and determination were their greatest strength. Kalen's ship was among the first to reach the heart of the enemy fleet, and as he watched the lasers streak across the void, he knew it was time. The throne would be gone, buried beneath the wreckage of the empire that had once ruled the galaxy. But it would be a new dawn for the galaxy, a dawn of freedom, of self-determination. The Warborn loyalists were falling back, their forces crumbling under the rebellion's assault. The battle was almost won, but Kalen could see the truth in their eyes. This wasn't just a battle of ships. It was a battle for the soul of the galaxy, for a future free from the shadow of a throne. And as the last of the Warborn forces retreated, Kalen's heart lifted. The rebellion had succeeded. The throne was no more. The galaxy was free.